this morning, and I want to talk about a shift in business models that's happening at this point in time, because of which customer centricity becomes extremely important. And I want to spend the next few minutes just laying out a few thoughts about how customer centricity doesn't stop at just providing our products and services to the customer. It goes on beyond that to solve the customer's end-to-end needs, which might involve actually providing products and services that are beyond the assets that we currently own. Traditionally, as businesses, we've always been very asset-focused. We look at what products and services we have, and we think of marketing as a way to bring these products and services to the customer. Increasingly, when we talk about customer centricity today, what we need to understand is that it's not so much about how can we ensure more and more of our products and services going to the customer. It's more about how can we create this end-to-end solution for the customer, which may extend or may be provided through a whole ecosystem of other partners that may be required to come on board. So to lay out this narrative, I want to share a few stories, some of which you are well aware of because they're increasingly seen as examples of what's changing in the world, what's happening in the name of disruption or transformation. And I want to lay out these stories and craft a narrative that's common across all of these stories. So let's look at a few of these. If you think of this company that we have on the screen, we're all aware of Uber, whether in a good way or a bad way, but we're all aware of what Uber is doing today. But one of the most fascinating things about Uber to me is not the idea that you can use your car as a remote control to the real world. One of the most fascinating things about Uber that I believe will be increasingly important is the idea that the middle manager can be replaced by an algorithm. And this is something that's never happened before. In the past, the algorithm has always been a way to replace something that can be easily automated, something that is repetitive. But what's happening in the case of Uber is that you're essentially using an algorithm to fundamentally rethink how resource allocation is done. The basic idea of business, of middle management, is to enable resource allocation efficiently, and that's what algorithms do in the case of Uber. And that's one big shift that's happening today. It's possible in the case of Uber to a large extent because the resources that are being allocated are highly commoditized. You don't really care which driver you get a ride from, you just want to get a ride. So it can be highly algorithmized from that perspective. But that gives us an indication of the fact that increasingly this kind of resource allocation could gradually move away to algorithms in other industries as well. The second thing that I find really interesting is what's happening with this company, Airbnb. If you look at this tweet, this is very prescient and it's very pithy in terms of explaining what's special about Airbnb. What's special is not its app, its website, or whatever. What really gives it the multiplier factor that Swami was talking about is the fact that it fights an asset-centered organization with an ecosystem-centered business model. Airbnb does not need to own any of the assets, the rooms, the accommodation that it provides out to its customers and customers at the end. So Airbnb is really using this ecosystem of partners whom we may think of as users, as hosts, but this is really an ecosystem of partners that's creating the value that Airbnb eventually provisions. So increasingly, we're seeing this happening a lot where ecosystems are being used to fight asset-centered organizations. But very often, we may think of these things as a flash in the pan, something that's about startups. Sometimes we may get distracted by the fact that they have ridiculous valuations, and our discussion may move to that. But let's look at what's happening in traditional industry, because fundamentally, the three factors that lead to these kinds of business models, the fact that we are ever connected, the fact that there is a lot of intelligence and data today, and the fact that production is becoming democratized, these three factors can be used even by traditional organizations, by large banks, by large healthcare organizations, to reinvent their business models in very similar ways. Let's take a look at a totally different company, a 100-year-old company, a Fortune 1000 company that is actually acting in a very strange way today. If you think of the company here, McCormick Foods, it's been in the very simple business of selling herbs and spices. So all it needs to do is source herbs, bottle them, sell them out into the market, and it's done. That's been the simple business of McCormick Foods for a long time. Today, instead of hiring just people in the food business, it's increasingly hiring a lot of data scientists. And the reason for that is that it wants to create a customer-centered food ecosystem. Just as Facebook provides a customer-centered media consumption model, McCormick wants to provide a customer-centered food consumption model. So what it's done is it's launched this thing called the flavor print, which asks users a series of questions. On the basis of those questions, it builds out a taste profile, which is really a data footprint of the user and what kind of foods the user likes to taste. Once that taste profile is developed, once that flavor print is developed, on the basis of that, it starts recommending the kinds of food that the user might like, the kinds of recipes that the user might enjoy. And of course, in the process of recommending the recipes, it also recommends its spices, because eventually it wants the platform that it's creating to reinforce its original business. But what's important is that over here, if you think of customer centricity, this whole idea can be extended to things that are way beyond what McCormick does today. Tomorrow, your flavor print could be used by you to determine what you should order at a restaurant, because on the menu, you might have the flavor print for every individual food next to it. So the whole idea of personalizing food consumption and not just sticking to selling more and more spices is what customer centricity is really about in today's world. Let's take another example. John Deere has been in the very simple business of selling tractors. And increasingly, it's getting into the business of guaranteeing agricultural outcomes for a multitude of stakeholders. So it's created this platform called the My John Deere platform, which aggregates data across a whole range of stakeholders and provides agricultural outcomes to all of them. The business today is no longer just about selling tractors. Tractors are the way to get data into the business and then move the business on from there. Think of Nike. Nike is not just interested in selling more and more shoes today. It's using the shoe as the center of an overall ecosystem around fitness. That ecosystem today consists of a shoe that is connected to the cloud. It consists of potentially, it used to have wearables that are connected to the cloud, and a whole series of apps that help you take decisions and connect with other users who are using Nike's products in a similar way. And that's what Nike does today. But with all of the data that is gathering over here, it could easily invite all kinds of third-party partners and create a much more holistic fitness solution back for the customer. So again, the point is that the whole idea of customer centricity is not restricted to your products and services. It's about creating this whole vibrant ecosystem around it. And this is best exemplified with what a retailer like Walgreens is doing today. Traditionally, Walgreens has just been in the pharmacy business. But what it realized was that the pharmacy business is a great way to know what kind of medicines users are consuming. And once you have the medicine profile of a user, you actually know a lot about the user's health condition, which allows you to connect them with all kinds of third-party providers who can help them with their wellness and cure. And that's what Walgreens does today with its telehealth platform. So across all of these things, one common thread that we repeatedly observe is that fundamentally the design of business is changing. And I want to clarify what exactly I mean by that. When we think of the design of business, traditionally we've always had businesses following the dominant design that I like to call the pipe or pipeline design, which is that you would source inputs into the business, you would add value on top of those inputs, and then you would push all of that out at the end of the pipe to somebody called the customer sitting over there who would just keep getting more and more output from you. And so the role of marketing over here was simply to ensure that the customer wanted more and more of what you wanted to push through the pipe. It was never about ensuring that the customer's needs were fulfilled in an end-to-end fashion. What's happening increasingly today is that this fundamental design of business is changing because of connectivity to a new design of business, which is the platform business model. What's special about the platform business model is that the design is no longer linear. The design today looks a lot like this. When we think of the platform, very often when we use the word platform, we think of the smartphone. And so if you look at the design of the smartphone as a business, if you think of what Apple and Android do, apart from the fact that they sell the handset, in the case of Apple, it sells the handset, what really drives value for the smartphone is the idea that anybody externally, any partner can come in and create value on top of the business, and a consumer can then come in and consume that value. And in doing that simple thing, what Apple has done it's just created one template phone that can be customized and extended in any direction by the user. Whereas in the past, Nokia and BlackBerry would have this whole portfolio of phones that were created in a pipe fashion by putting in a set of applications that would make a phone unique. Today, every phone is individually unique just because of this ecosystem of partners that Apple has created on top of its phone. The second example, Airbnb, is something that we talked about, where again, hosts and travelers are brought together on top of this platform and they interact with each other. YouTube, again, is an example that works in a very similar manner. And I'm using some of the examples that we are extremely well aware of, but as we abstract what works in this model, we gradually realize that a lot of this can be applied, all of this can be applied in many ways to traditional pipe businesses as well, as they move towards becoming platforms. Again, Amazon works in a very similar model where it brings in writers and readers and allows them to directly interact with each other. So if you think of this whole model, what's the template that we see repeatedly in this model is that the business no longer takes care of production. The business creates an infrastructure on which an external ecosystem of participants come on board. They create value, which then attracts consumers, and then the business essentially plays just two roles. It provides this plug-and-play infrastructure on which value can be increasingly created, and it ensures the governance of the interactions between these two sides. Because at the end of the day, the business has a brand of its own. And so it needs to ensure that it provides consumers with the minimum protection that is required to interact with third-party producers, and it needs to ensure that the third-party producers are appropriately incentivized to not work on other channels, but to work on top of this business. So this is the fundamental structure of this new emerging business model that's becoming increasingly important across industries, as we'll see very shortly. A few things that are interesting in this shift from pipes to platforms. When you think of pipes, we always think of competitive advantage on pipes on the basis of resources. The more resources you have, the better resources you have, the better you can compete. So it was always the inimitable resource that determined who won in the case of pipe competition. In the case of platforms, very often platforms do not have any resources. But the point is not whether platforms have resources or not. Uber may not own taxis, but some other company may own resources and still be a platform. What's important is that whether you own resources or not, your competitive advantage on a platform model is not on the basis of resources. It's on the basis of the ecosystem of producers and consumers you pull together that stay on over there. And so the fundamental way in which firms compete and the fundamental factors that enable firms to compete changes. The second thing that changes is that in the case of the pipe model, the goal of the pipe business is always to isolate a central process of value creation and keep making it more and more repeatable and efficient. We understand that intuitively. We do that day in and day out. But what a platform business does is, in the platform business, value creation is not determined by the central process. It's determined by an external interaction between producers and consumers. And so the goal now is to ensure that this external interaction becomes repeatable and efficient. And the factors that lead to repeatability and efficiency of an external interaction are very non-intuitive. Because fundamentally, as a firm, as a business, we've always understood how to manage things that we control. When you are a platform business, you have to manage things that you do not directly control. You have to ensure that you're open in the right ways and closed on the assets that are most important. You have to ensure that you provide the right incentives for everyone to participate on top of your platform. And so when we move from pipes to platforms, one of the first things is that we move from a process-first model to an interaction-first model. This has a few different bearings. The first thing is that in the case of a pipe business, the role of data is just that of an enabler. What I mean by that is that data is purely informing business decisions in the case of a pipe. So you might be focused on the customer, but what really happens is you're trying to understand more and more about the customer and just serving more and more of your products and services better to the customer. Data is merely an enabler at that point. What happens with platforms is that data is not just an enabler, it's actually the driver of business. If you think of what happens on a platform like Uber, data is what decides which traveler should get which driver. So data is what drives the two things together. If you think of what happens on an Amazon today, data is what decides what kind of product should be served to you based on what you're looking for. And now that you've bought that particular product, what else would you be most likely to buy based on what others have been buying in the past? So data drives business in the case of platforms, which is not to the same extent in the case of pipes, where data has always been more of an enabler. It's always been a source of analytics rather than a business decision maker of itself. Another thing that happens when we move from pipes to platforms is that you don't just market to the consumer, you market to an entire ecosystem that might involve external producers as well. So a lot of your marketing activities may be directed to third-party partners who you would want to come on board so that they can serve your consumers and provide an end-to-end solution through your platform. And as a result of that, marketing fundamentally has always been about demand generation and fulfillment. You have this pipe, you need to generate pull at the end of this pipe so that you can push more and more things through that pipe. So as long as you can generate that pull, and as long as you can fulfill that pull, your role of marketing is done. That doesn't cut it in the case of platforms. What happens with platforms is that you need to do two things in particular. You need to ensure that there are incentives rightly structured for all participants. Because if you want to get third-party partners on board, they need to be appropriately incentivized to come on board. And if you want consumers to stick onto your platform, you need to ensure that they have accretive incentives, that as they use your platform more and more, they find it more and more useful and want to stick on. Because fundamentally, today, the consumer has liquid expectations, and the consumer is highly distracted. So it doesn't take the consumer much time to move from your brand to another brand. And that's why it's very important that you have incentives aligned across the ecosystem, because what happens in the case of platforms is once partners start getting disincentivized, the value for consumers decreases. Once consumers start feeling disincentivized, the value for partners decreases, and so the two sides reinforce each other both positively and negatively. And so because of that, very often technology helps you grow with a multiplier effect, but it also helps you fail with a multiplier effect, as you would have seen in the case of MySpace losing out to Facebook, for example. So across all of this, what we see is that fundamentally the platform business model, the role of the model is to focus on enabling interactions, and its essential goal is to provide that infrastructure that enables these interactions. And the goal of the platform overall is to increase the quality and quantity of these interactions. Now, if we talk about how this is happening across different industries, just to give a brief summary of what's already happened, the whole telecom industry, the whole handset manufacturing industry has already seen this shift happen, where in a span of less than 8 years, the two market leaders fell down and lost more than 95% of their market share and market value. And the key reason for that shift was the fact that fundamentally, Nokia, BlackBerry used to work in this pipe model, and Apple, by applying the platform model, ensured that every customer could personalize their own phone. That is the height of customer centricity, because you are ensuring that you are potentially creating 1 million different phones for 1 million different people, whereas Nokia could only create a certain number of phones. And that's what happens when you move to a platform, because your partners who are creating value on top of the platform allow you to enable that kind of personalization. The second thing that's happening is what's happening with hotels versus Airbnb today. 5 years back, hotels used to think of Airbnb as this hipster mattress sharing website that nobody needed to care about. And over the last year, I've been repeatedly called in by the senior management of hotels to try to understand how to respond to Airbnb. And that's because fundamentally what's happening is Airbnb is providing extremely personalized forms of accommodation by just providing a sheer range of accommodation options and overlaying a reputation layer on top of it so that consumers can decide where they would like to stay and where they would not like to stay. So the choice that's available on Airbnb is just that much higher on every parameter. If you think of what's happening with publishing again, traditional publishing worked in a very linear model, and it had a gatekeeper sitting in between called the editor. And today, publishing works on a platform model where anyone can come and create a book on Amazon, and to the extent that they can market and get it to a market, Amazon provides them openness from that perspective. So in all of these examples, we've seen an explosion of value happening whenever you move from pipes to platforms, and we've always seen the customer, the consumer, winning at the end of the game when pipes have shifted to platforms. If we think of it in terms of the industries that remain to be affected by this in a big way today, and a lot of my work focuses on understanding how and where industries are in this shift today, There are typically three different categories of industries that I would think of, which are at various stages in their roadmap towards being transformed into platforms. So the first category of industries are what I would think of as information-intensive industries, where the principal value that is delivered to the consumer is information-intensive. So if you think of media, it's a highly information-intensive industry, and that's why they're in a lot of trouble because of the internet, because a lot of traditional media business models have converted into platform business models today. TV is facing a lot of competition from YouTube. Newspapers are facing a lot of competition from Medium and other forms of blogging platforms. So one of the first indicators of whether an industry is going to be hit by platforms is how information intensive that particular industry is. Another example is telecommunications and specifically the handset industry, because the value of a handset was not so much in the hardware as in the software that was on the handset. And by making that a platform, Apple ensured and Android ensured that the whole industry was disrupted. So information-intensive industries are the first to get disrupted when platforms come into the picture. Or if I were to put a positive spin on it, they are the first to find opportunities for transformation when platforms come into the picture. Which brings us to a second category of industries, which are also information-intensive, but they are heavily regulated. So the reason these industries take more time getting disrupted is because regulation prevents a platform model from taking hold in a big way with the mass market. And secondly, a lot of these industries also have really high costs of transaction failure. So if you're creating an alternate market of producers and consumers interacting with each other, and if any of those interactions fail, the cost of failure is just too high. Banking is a classic case of such an industry. Healthcare is another example of such an industry. If you think of both banking and healthcare and even education, all of these are information-intensive industries at the end of the day. We often think of healthcare as a services industry, but healthcare is actually services delivered purely around the idea of patient data. So whoever has the patient data knows what kinds of services will best be delivered to the patient, and in that process owns the outcomes that should be taking place in that industry. But traditionally, healthcare has always worked like a pipe. It's always seen the insurance company as the customer, not the patient as the customer. And as a result, it's always captured data that is relevant to the insurance company. It's never captured data that is relevant to the patient. And what we're seeing today is healthcare is fundamentally shifting away from this traditional model of pipes to a model of customer-centered ecosystems where all healthcare firms realize that there is no one healthcare firm that can provide an end-to-end solution to a customer. And so they need to come together in an ecosystem format in some way to solve this end-to-end problem. And it's actually very interesting if you look at what's happening in the healthcare industry today. 5 different types of companies which were never competing with each other in the past are suddenly competing with each other. At one end, we have the hospitals who are getting a lot of data about customers because of movement to electronic health records. At the other end, we have somebody like Apple or Google who's also getting into health, again getting at it from the data side. On the third side, we have pharmacies like Walgreens, which have a lot of data about the patient again. And then on the fourth side, we have the pharmaceutical companies themselves trying to get a lot of this data because eventually they want to ensure that they understand the patient better as well. And on the fifth end of it, we have consumer goods companies like Philips that are coming into this game, creating wearables, Nike, again, creating wearables, trying to get into this game, again, of providing an end-to-end outcome for the patient. All of them are trying to fight for the same pool of patient data. Whoever owns that patient data is going to own the customer-centered ecosystem that's going to solve the problem in the future. And that's what's really playing out in the healthcare industry today, especially over the last 2 to 3 years. So that's an example of an industry that was waiting to be disrupted, heavily regulated, and now is facing a lot of the pressures that are likely to move it towards a platform model. The final category of industries that get affected by platforms are what I would think of as resource-intensive industries. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, pipes always fight on the basis of their unique access to resources. So if you think of a mining company, you don't hear of a lot of startups getting into mining because mining is very difficult to start up in because there's a lot of upfront cost involved in prospecting, for example. Oil and gas, again, it's very difficult to start up over there. So resource-intensive industries have always been extremely resistant to the onslaught of digitization. But what's happening today, very interestingly, is because of the Internet of Things and because of the democratization of technologies in the form of 3D printing, for example, resource-intensive industries are getting digitized as well. And the moment resource-intensive industries get digitized, they become data industries, they become information industries. So think of the kinds of implications it can have. If you are a mining company, today you can connect all the equipment in your mine to a central platform in a way that you do not need to send people into the mine. It has very interesting implications from there. If you do not need to send people into the mine, you can start mining in all kinds of places that you would not have mined in the past. Moreover, the moment you've connected all of these machines centrally to a platform, you can start benefiting from the initial idea that I shared about Uber, which is your middle management can be replaced by algorithms, because all the information that needs to be processed in a mine is within a very specific context. And that's increasingly happening in the top mining companies today. Most importantly, when all of this data comes onto a central platform, you can open out this prospecting data to a larger ecosystem of startup mines who then will not have to spend so much time in prospecting. They would just use your data, mine that data to figure out what is the unique kind of mining activity that they would want to get involved in. And so a whole range of opportunities are opening up in an industry as traditional as mining today because of platforms, purely because digitization has hit this industry over the last 2 to 3 years in particular. So broadly, depending on where you are in this whole spectrum, there are various ways in which platforms will be affecting your firm, whether it's in the extremely information-intensive side, heavily regulated side, or the resource-intensive side. There are different ways in which platforms are affecting what's happening in the industry. There are different timelines that the traditional firms may have to transform themselves, and there are different advantages that new emerging firms may have to disrupt these industries as a basis of the idea of platforms. If we look at all of these stories of disruption that I just talked about, all of these stories of transformation with platforms, we see 4 narratives that are repeated across all of these industries repeatedly. We see these 4 things happening repeatedly, and if there are symptoms of this in any industry that you participate in, that could be very well be an opportunity for a platform to come in again. The first is that if an industry has an inefficient gatekeeper, platforms solve the problem. What inefficient gatekeepers do is they prevent information from the supply side reaching the demand side. The classic case of information inefficiency or asymmetry is the used car business. Consumers never know what kind of car to buy because what kind of used car to buy because they never know how good that used car is. But in many different ways, that gatekeeping problem exists in many other industries as well. As I mentioned, in the publishing industry, the supply side never gets access to the demand side because there's an editor sitting in between. So whenever you have an inefficient gatekeeper, what a platform does is it comes in, re-intermediates that industry, and creates a more scalable and efficient gatekeeper. And so the market moves towards the platform because it's just more scalable and efficient. The second thing that platforms do is they unlock new sources of value, whether it's the Airbnb example that I mentioned in the beginning, or whether it's the mining example that I mentioned just now, that with the release of this data, you can start creating new startup mines that would never have been possible. So platforms always unlock new sources of value by democratizing the ability to produce. A third thing that platforms do is that they aggregate fragmented and inefficient markets. And a classic example of that is Yelp or TripAdvisor. The whole accommodation industry traditionally has been extremely fragmented, but TripAdvisor provides the decision support that consumers need to decide where they want to stay. And a final thing that platforms do very often is that they enable new production paradigms. If you think of what Wikipedia does, Wikipedia has taken a supply chain and has converted it into a network. Traditionally, if you had to create an encyclopedia, which is what Encyclopedia Britannica used to do, you would put people together into a room. They would decide what kinds of topics they want to write about. They would start writing that. They would have editors look at it, and then they would create this whole volume of books and push it out. And Wikipedia transforms this whole set of actions, unbundles it from a linear model, rebundles it into a network, and creates a living encyclopedia that is constantly updated. And the reason we haven't seen Wikipedia models increasingly so far has been that while platforms help in aggregating and matchmaking very well, coordination technologies that are required for coordination of multiple actions have been very nascent so far. The wiki has been one of the few, wiki as a technology has been one of the few coordination technologies that existed. But increasingly now, with artificial intelligence gaining a lot of ground, we're going to see a lot more coordination technologies come in. And so entire manufacturing supply chains can potentially move to a Wikipedia model in the future. Across all of these things, we repeatedly come back to the idea of the fact that technology has a multiplier effect. But we never unpack that in terms of why technology has a multiplier effect. And in the case of platforms, it's especially true because platforms have always grown in this where you have a particular point till which growth moves in a certain direction, and then after this inflection point, growth skyrockets. Suddenly, things start growing really fast. And there's a reason why after that inflection point, growth increases so fast, why this multiplier effect kicks in. There are 5 different factors that make platforms highly effective at multiplying much faster than a pipe would ever have made it possible. The first thing that platforms benefit from are the idea of zero marginal costs. When you can accrete more and more value without having to bear the cost of that value, you're going to scale much faster. And that's, again, the Airbnb model that I mentioned in the beginning. Whenever you have an ecosystem, you're going to accrete value with near zero marginal costs. The second and most important reasons platforms scale so fast is the idea of the network effect. We understand the network effect fundamentally as the idea of the telephone. The first telephone would have been utterly useless, but as more and more telephones were used, the value of the telephone grew non-linearly because the number of connections was what was important in terms of giving value to the telephone. But what's important about the internet is that the internet is even more powerful in its multiplier effect than the telephone. The fundamental difference between the telephone and the internet is that on a telephone, when you have a discussion, you benefit from the network effect that both of you use the phone, but the moment you close the discussion, it does not benefit anybody else. On the internet, if you create a video for somebody and you open it out to the world, 1,000 other people can benefit from that video as well. And that is because the internet is the largest infrastructure that allows the creation of persistent value. And that is why the network effect on the internet, on any internet-enabled model, is way more powerful than the network effect of a telephone. And what becomes really powerful on the internet is this idea of a two-sided network effect, where as more and more producers create value, more and more consumers will come in, and as more consumers come in, more producers will find value in participating in that network. And that is the idea of building an ecosystem. As more and more third-party partners come in, more consumers will find value, and the two sides will keep on holding each other together without you having to keep marketing to either side in the long run. A third reason that's very important in terms of the marketing multiplier is that today businesses are increasingly investing in behavior design. And the reason behavior design is possible today and was never possible in the past is because of data. Because fundamentally, behavior design is a data problem. When we create habits in our children, what we're essentially doing is we're using data about their behavior and giving feedback on the basis of that data. That's essentially what companies are doing today. By gathering data about you, they provide feedback on the basis of that, and they ensure that over the course of that feedback, they design a behavior that enables them to stick to you more and more in the future. A fourth driver for this multiplier effect is the fact that businesses today increasingly have learning filters. And this is a fundamental difference between MySpace and Facebook. I use the example of Facebook over here, but what's interesting is that very often we think of MySpace and Facebook as the same thing. We think of both of them as social networks. But actually, they could not be more different. They are in fundamentally different industries if you would think of it. Because MySpace was something that you would use only when you wanted to connect with somebody. So MySpace was solving a very different problem. It was trying to fulfill an active need, which is I want to connect with a particular friend. Facebook is something that you use even when you don't want to connect with anyone. You just use it to know what's happening in your network. And that's because of a learning filter, a filter that keeps on figuring out what should it serve to you from what's happening in your network, so that the usage shifts from an active need to a passive habit. So while MySpace would have been something you would use once in 3 days, Facebook ends up being something you use 30 times a day because of this learning filter in particular. And finally, the most important for the multiplier effect is the idea of virality. And I want to just explain the idea of virality because one of the most fundamental mistakes that companies make is they think that virality and word of mouth are the same thing, whereas actually they're two completely different things. Only a small number of companies can benefit from virality. Almost anybody can benefit from word of mouth. Word of mouth is what happens when somebody loves your product so much that they cannot stop talking about it. So for word of mouth to happen, you need to ensure that somebody actually loves your product. Otherwise, it will just not happen. Virality is different because virality happens even when people don't love your product. Virality happens by virtue of the fact that people use your product. Think of Instagram. Nobody needed to use Instagram and say, hey, this is so good, why don't you try it? They just had to take a picture, and it would prompt them to share the picture on Facebook. And by virtue of sharing the picture on Facebook, Instagram would get exposed to a whole new set of users. So virality is something that benefits from a much larger group of users. You don't need to ensure that somebody actually loves your product. You just need to ensure that the motivations of the user to share their creations are aligned with the motivations of your product to spread further aboard. And that's why virality is much more powerful and much more controllable by the business than word of mouth ever was. So these 5 things are the reason companies benefit from a multiplier effect today in the age of platforms. And if I were to bring all of this together, if we think of the idea of building platforms, the fundamental idea is that we need to design the interaction first before we ever build the technology. Once we design the interaction, we need to know where we want to start this ecosystem. Can we bring in the producers first? Do we know a lot of ecosystem partners who can come in first? And then we create a unified solution to the consumer? Or should we get in the consumer first, hook him in, and then using that data about the consumer, attract third parties on board? So depending on which side you are more effective starting, this would be a key decision that would determine how and in what manner you launch your platform. And once you've done that, once you figured out the interaction and where you start, that's when you figure out what is the technology that enables this interaction. What are the set of rules that will govern this interaction? And over time, you scale this by using the 5 forces of multiplication that I just talked about. You need to ensure that in the long run, there are cross-sided network effects that get started because of using all of those 5 specific forces. If I were to run through, at the end of it, just a few key ideas about what it means to invert your firm, to traditionally change the way you have been thinking and completely move it towards the customer and build an ecosystem around that customer, and forget about being resource-centric or product or service or asset-centric. There are quite a few things that I bunched together as a platform manifesto. What should companies be thinking about when they move towards platforms? The first thing is that companies need to realize that today the ecosystem is the new warehouse. You don't need to own all the things that will provide an end-to-end solution. You just need to ensure that your ecosystem owns all the things that provides the end-to-end solution. Secondly, as evidenced with the case of Wikipedia, the ecosystem is the new supply chain as well. You don't need to create and assemble and build all these things together. Coordination technologies are improving really fast today, and there are ways for this to happen in the ecosystem around your business as well. Third, and quite importantly, is the idea that data is the new dollar. What I mean by that is fundamentally, we've always optimized our businesses to capture dollars. And the way we optimize it is by creating something called accounting. Accounting is what ensures that dollars are coming in and dollars are going out, and the 2 things are being tracked. When we become a data business, we do not just look at what data do we have and how can I put analytics on top of that data. Fundamentally, we need to rethink the question and ask ourselves, what data do we need? And if we do not have that data today, how do we get that data? Which means that we may have to launch services just to get data in. And very often we get confused about this whole idea of why is something free? Why is a company not making money? Why are they giving something away for free? In general, free is not a good idea, but free is a great idea if it is helping you get the data in that can then be monetized in other ways, in a variety of other mechanisms, and that can then reinforce your business. But data will never come into your business, especially if you're a large business, unless you do accounting for it. Because the only reasons dollars come into your business is because of accounting. So there has to be a mechanism by which you account for data, by which you figure out how you're tracking data in and data out and monetizability of the data. A fourth thing that's really important is that community management is not marketing. It's not about putting out a message to users about your products and services. Community management is actually an extension of what I would think of as human resources management, because HR internally is about balancing incentives. It's about creating the right incentives for your labor workforce to create output for the company. And community management is very similar. You have to create the right incentives for producers in your ecosystem to come in and start creating value. If you think of Instagram, after the founders, the first employee was neither an engineer nor the designer, which is quite non-Silicon Valley in a way. The first employee on Instagram was a community manager, because they realized that the whole engagement on Instagram happens because the community creates value, and so they have to be incentivized enough to keep creating that value. Another thing that's important in the case of platforms is to know that when you do not own all the inventory, you need to extend beyond inventory management to liquidity management, which is you need to get to a stage where you can manage the meeting of supply and demand in your ecosystem. You need to ensure that partners find the right consumers, that consumers find the right value when they need that value. And in a way, though not perfectly executed, but Uber's surge pricing is a mechanism of liquidity management. It ensures that the consumer finds a car, even at a higher price, when cars are not available. So this Uber's surge pricing, for example, may be a very mathematical and algorithmic way of doing it, but the whole idea that your role does not stop just at inventory management, but goes beyond it to actually orchestrate resources in the ecosystem is what's really powerful and important in an age of platforms. Another thing that's important is that user-driven curation and reputation become very important. When you get partners from outside, you might do some kind of quality control for those partners, but you need to have some form of feedback mechanism by which users can constantly provide curation and reputation information. Another thing that's increasingly important today in a world of platforms is that user journeys are not like the traditional sales funnels. The traditional sales model was always very linear. I saw something in a newspaper, I walked into a retail outlet, I came back with the product, and I was done. And that was a very linear model. You knew exactly what led to what, and at what point a final outcome was achieved. And so it could be modeled as a funnel. Today, it's no longer possible that way, because companies and businesses have multiple touch points. And unless you have a single view of the user across all of these touch points, especially if you're the retailer with both offline and online presence, unless you have a single view of the customer across both your online touch points, your technology-driven touch points, as well as your in-store touch points, you cannot manage the consumer journey end-to-end for that particular consumer. As I mentioned earlier, behavior design is becoming increasingly important, because traditionally, loyalty programs and lock-ins were good enough to sort of quote-unquote trap customers with your business. But today, when customers have more and more choice, it's becoming more important to create new behaviors that allow them to stick onto your business. And the way to create a behavior is to ensure that when a consumer interacts with your business the 100th time, he gets way more value than when he interacts the first time. So there should be some form of accretion of value over time because of the data that you captured about the consumer. Facebook, as an example, is one such example where by creating this daily habit, you are making it more and more relevant to the consumer on an ongoing basis as you capture more data about the consumer. Another thing that's important is that data science is becoming really important today, and as I mentioned earlier, that is because data is no longer just an enabler of decision making, it's actually a driver of business. And that's why data science is important, not for analytics, but for actually running the business in real time, for enabling algorithms to take decisions in real time. Social feedback is really important when you're building ecosystems, because unless partners get social feedback, unless they get encouragement, they will not want to keep on participating on your platform in the longer run. And increasingly, algorithms are the new decision makers, as I mentioned with the case of Uber, where the whole middle management layer is an algorithm today. Another thing that's really important today is that because of APIs, business development is not contractual any longer. It does not have to rely on contracts that get renewed once in 3 years. Business development today is extremely fluid, where you can open up your API, people can build using that API, and you can actually track how your partners are performing and what kinds of behaviors they're exhibiting through that API-driven collaboration. And so plug and play into your platform is the most efficient form of business development today. A lot of companies are increasingly opening APIs so that even if they have to eventually acquire the company, they would rather acquire somebody whose data is already integrated with their data. And finally, in terms of a culture, traditionally, we've always had a very iron-fisted culture, especially inside traditional organizations. It's been a very command and control hierarchical model of running an organization. But as more and more value starts getting delivered by the ecosystem, by other partners, by your users who are producing in the ecosystem, you realize that a lot of value creation cannot be done using the iron fist model. It has to be done using an encouraging and an invisible hand model, where you create the right incentives, and the incentives drive the actual behavior that you require from your ecosystem. And finally, just to sum it all up, as I mentioned, the network effect is the single most important thing that makes ecosystems powerful. As producers create more value, consumers get more benefit. As consumers get more benefit, they stick on, and the producers stick on as well. So once you have a network effect between producers and consumers, and if it's strong enough, they won't leave you and move off in another direction. And so the network effect, and whether you are able to create that network effect, is the single most important driver for success in an age of platforms. So to wrap it all up, I want to re-emphasize that very often we think of this whole shift as being a shift of a movement from the physical world to the digital world. And very often, to tick all the boxes, we say, do we have big data? Yes, we have big data. Do we have an online presence? Do we have an app? Yes, we have all of these things. And we think that we've already made the transition. But the transition is actually much bigger. It's actually a fundamental redesign of the business. And that is why, to me, the shift that is important is not the shift of physical to digital. You could be moving to digital, and you could not be changing anything in your business. The shift that's really important today is a shift from pipes to platforms along the ideas that I shared over here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sangeet. I would like you to stay back for a while. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. So please raise your question cards and look for our mic marshals. They will be able to help you with the mics. Questions, please. In the interest of time, we will take a few questions right now, and you can always chat up with Sangeet over the breaks. So any questions? We have someone there. Mike marshals. Pages.
Hello. Good morning. This is Pranav from CMI Industry. We are a European company based in India, looking after steel, defense, and environment division. I am the business head and innovation head of Southeast Asia region. Nice presentation, I would say, and well understood by me at least, and a very new concept understood by me, literally started by me in small sectors, but I think more to be done, as you rightly explained. But my question is that when you talked about the value point, is it not right that let customer decide the value? In India, what we find that the manufacturer like us, we decide the value for the product, rather than let the customer decide its own value, give it to the manufacturer, and then that concept of platform will be more successful. Also, I find it in India that only e-governance, if you find the e-tenders, many of people must be quoting online, you see the lowest price bidding is the only winner in the business, whatever you deal. There is no mention of quality, there is no mention of delivery, there is no mention of services after sales. So why these points are not considered while using the business module of any product or services in India?
Sure. So for the first question, you actually restated what I stated throughout my presentation, that actually the customer has to decide. You do not decide. You do not decide what comes in the ecosystem. And the way the customer decides it is by giving you his data. Because if you're serving 1 million customers, you cannot really get it one-on-one from each and every customer. You get that through the data that comes in from the customer, whether that data is provided explicitly. So if I'm creating a shoe and I allow somebody to customize that shoe, that's an explicit provision of data. Or the data is coming implicitly. Because of the way you use shoes today, I know what kind of shoes will work best for you. So absolutely, the whole idea of a platform is that it has to be built around the fact that the customer will tell you what they want, and you have to provide an end-to-end solution, irrespective of the fact that you own the solution provisioning ability or not. So completely agree with you on the first point there. On the second point, in general, across all markets, forget India, in any market, when you have really poor information about parameters other than price, price becomes the most important single parameter. And as a result, it becomes very difficult to start creating or positioning value on other parameters. What platforms do very often is that they come in and they create this reputation layer that provides all these other parameters. So depending on how commoditized your product is, how fragmented your industry is, price will become an increasingly important parameter. But that is exactly where a platform play can become really valuable in today's world, where a platform can come in, gather a lot of information from these interactions, and then create value on top of it. I'll just give you an example. There are 2 or 3 different implementations that I've advised which have worked in B2B industries, where they've tried to create a reputation layer for an entire B2B ecosystem. The way they did that was they first created a software as a service, a SaaS application that manages interactions between different firms. So it could be invoicing, it could be inventory delivery, it could be any of these interactions. And using this initial software, customers, essentially all these companies just manage their day-to-day process, but the platform at the back end gathers implicit data about what kind of interactions are working out well, when is somebody paying on time, when is somebody delivering on time, and creates a whole reputation layer. What happens after that is that once you have a reputation layer created, you can actually go to a particular, or you can put out a message to a particular business on the platform saying, the average reputation of your suppliers is only 6 on 10. Here's a new supplier whose reputation is actually 8 on 10 and meets the price that your supplier provides. So you create a whole new layer of transparency in the market because of the data that you gathered. So that is actually happening in various industries. I would be very surprised if whatever industry you are in, it doesn't happen in the next few years.
Hello. Thank you, Sangeet. It's really very illuminating. My name is Kingshuk. I'm from InfoSearch. And just trying to look at the future the way you have kind of projected it. And we are talking about platforms and ecosystems. So does that necessarily mean that very few are going to survive while lots are struggling currently? See the M&As that are happening. But there can be only so many ecosystems existing parallelly. And the way to go about doing business successfully is possibly to become a participant in that ecosystem, the producer or a prosumer, you sell as well as you buy, and not really aim for scale at all, or some way we give up and say that, okay, we have had enough, The middle part of the businesses, that is the middle management or the middle class, or the mid-level companies are going to totally get squeezed out. They're not going to be here, say, 10 years from now. Is that the kind of future you are?
Well, that's a really important question, especially at this point in time, because this shift has really started in traditional businesses only over the last 3 years. So at this point, it's to a large extent in a lot of industries, it's a level playing ground. But you're right, you cannot have every company building an ecosystem because there are only so many consumers, there are only so many partners, and there is a cost to participating in any ecosystem, whether the cost is in terms of resources or in terms of time, whatever that be. So when I think of ecosystems, there are 2 ecosystems broadly that are important to understand. The first are cross-market ecosystems. So something like Uber today has the potential to build out an ecosystem for transportation and logistics across the market. And then there are thematic ecosystems. Something like Nike today could build out the fitness ecosystem around the shoe. But that does not stop Adidas from building out an ecosystem on a different theme. Not fitness potentially, but something else, which could again be centered around the idea of the fact that it's a shoe company, but it's a fundamentally different theme. So the new, or the opportunity that I believe businesses have today is that the playing field for thematic ecosystems is wide open. Even having said that, thematic ecosystems also have an end limit. You cannot have millions of thematic ecosystems. As a consumer, today I may interact with 15 brands. Tomorrow I may participate in 15 or 20 thematic ecosystems because that solves my problem best. So at some point, that middle class question that you mentioned about companies is always going to come up. which is what do we do when we are neither getting out of business or we are not being thrown out of business completely, but we are not a platform as well. And that's where it's really important to make the choice of what platforms you want to participate on when. And it's also important to understand that when platforms benefit from the multiplier effect, if you come on board a platform before the multiplier effect sets in, your business can grow with the multiplier effect. If you come on later, the businesses that have already grown with the multiplier effect keep on benefiting from it, whereas you have a much harder time creating that for yourself. So what's going to become an increasingly important decision for these middle layer companies is which platform should I partner with at what point, especially given the fact that the platform has not yet won the market. Because the idea with platforms is once network effects set in, you won't have too many people doing the same thing, because the network effects will ensure that there's one platform that wins. So the big decision factor for such companies will be, how do I figure out what platform is going to win before it actually wins? It's an interesting thought, because I've actually done a lot of work on this particular thing as well, which is totally to lay it out for companies who just decide we don't want to spend our time thinking about platforms for the next 3 years, but we want to know which ecosystems to participate in. And there's a whole multivariate decision that involves as well. So broadly, I think, at the end of the day, you will either be the ecosystem creator or you will have to participate in an ecosystem for which you will need to know how to do that. But the last thing I just want to clarify over there is that whether you can build an ecosystem or not is not predicated by how big you are today. If you look at what's happening in Germany, there are a lot of mom and pop, I won't say mom and pop, but family-owned auto parts, spare parts manufacturers that are today trying to build ecosystems around the idea of transportation, around the idea of efficiency, by just ensuring that their spare parts have a sensor, and that sensor captures data that can then feed into a platform from which they can grow further. So your ability to build an ecosystem, while you may have the advantage of already having a big consumer base and starting from there, but even if you do not have that, your ability is not restricted by the assets and the size of the business that you have today. So that's why I again reiterate that it is a wide open playing field today, and Germany is a really, the German automobile industry is a really good example of that at this point.
Thank you very much.
Sangeet, wonderful presentation. My question is, in a customer centricity world, from pipe to platform, what is the shift required in the organizational culture?
That's a great question. In particular, culture-wise, a couple of things that are really important is when we move from the idea of asset centricity to user centricity, the first thing is to figure out how do you become an organization that starts thinking in terms of data. And that is why I mentioned the idea of data accounting, because unless you start thinking in terms of data and you create a culture of acquiring data and rewarding the acquisition of data, you won't start acquiring data of yourself, and you won't move towards a full platform model. What I see today very often is when companies are moving or saying quote unquote digital transformation, they're trying to just convert their channels, they're trying to convert their assets and digitize all of these things without changing the fundamental issue of, are we a data absorbing organization or not? And are we rewarding the absorption of data or not? So that's fundamentally one thing that's very important. The second thing that's going to be really important is how we start managing our ecosystem partners, because a lot of the culture today is built around the idea of contractual management of ecosystem partners. Whereas in a world of platforms, you're going to have a real-time partnership model because of APIs. You're going to have communities participating on your business. So there has to be a culture that fosters communities, that fosters this kind of partnership model. So these are 2 or 3 of the most important impacts that need to be factored into how you build the culture. When we abstract that back, what becomes important is that none of these things is possible by just going top-down at it. Because top-down, it's difficult to understand what are the opportunities for data absorption, what are the kinds of feedback coming in from the ecosystem in real time. So there has to be a real-time feedback within the organization as well, and a culture that supports that to enable the shift towards a platform.
Yeah, hi, Sandeep. Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, I'm Sonia Bhatia. I head customer centricity function in Piramal Healthcare. We are into CRAMS business, contract research and manufacturing. We are driving customer centricity since last 2 years, and we have done a lot of work in that. My question to you is, what top 3 things you did in your organization to promote customer centricity culture?
Do you mean what I did in my organization or what I
Yes.
did with my clients?
No, in your organization.
Sure. Well, it's a very different kind of business. My business is what I would think of as more of thought leadership centered. And so the way companies work with me and my organization is they engage with my work themselves on a self-serve model. They see it work for themselves, and then they engage in various models with my organization. So the way that works is there's, to promote that customer centricity, there's a lot of intelligence around how you build platforms, how you manage platforms that is available for free for people to use. That is the hook through which users of this work come in and start applying this. And at a certain point when they've actually applied and seen results, and all through this data captured about which kind of user is interacting with what kind of content. So if a CEO of a Fortune 500 company signs up with my content and knows and starts interacting with certain kinds of content, and based on the profile of the CEO, I can actually figure out, the system can actually figure out how that interaction is happening and what broad problems that that particular executive must be interested in understanding. And so the system can start recommending the right content in the future to that particular user as well. So there is that level of customer centricity put in where I've tried to model the whole idea of business information and thought leadership in the form of a Facebook newsfeed, which is based on what you're reading, more things of that sort get emailed to you. And once businesses apply this on an ongoing basis, what happens with my work is that thousands of companies apply it, and a small fraction of those companies would be my customers who would actually engage in a very deep engagement. But because of the large-scale application and validation of these ideas, the original corpus of thinking becomes more and more accurate, and specific. And so that's how I end up creating that customer centricity to a large extent in what I do. Rather, if it was just a pipe model, I would be saying this is what platform thinking is, and why don't I come in and help you to become a platform? And that's not how it works.
Okay, thanks. So in your organization, did you do the customer journey mapping and all before you started on?
Well, it's evolved over time because there's not a lot of there are not a lot of templates out there for building a C-level advisory business purely off content. And so I had to learn as I went. But the idea was that, yes, you had to be extremely customer-centric, because the most wasteful thing you can do in any organization is spend your time selling things to people. Instead, once you know what customers want, you will have a way for them to come to you. And that's, over time, that's how it's evolved, so that there is no selling involved at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.